I gave my kidney to the girl I loved. She put me in a spreadsheet labeled Kidney Guy number 20. When I finally asked if she ever loved me, she smiled and said, "You are a good investment." I gave my kidney to the girl I loved. She put me in a spreadsheet labeled Kidney Guy number 20. When I finally asked if she ever loved me, she smiled and said, "You are a good investment." I didn't say a word. That was 310 days ago. This morning, she saw the jury and vomited into her lawyer's purse. Megan had this laugh that made you forget your own name. On the first day of sophomore year in college, she dropped her chemistry textbook right in front of me. When I helped her pick it up, she smiled like I just saved her life. "My hero," she said, touching my arm. 3 weeks later, I was driving her everywhere because her car was always in the shop. Buying her lunch because she forgot her wallet again. My friends called me whipped. I called it love. Other guys just want one thing. "You actually care," she'd always say. And I did care. Too much. Junior year, everything changed. Megan collapsed during her morning jog with genetic kidney disease. The doctors were blunt. Dialysis 3 times a week or find a donor. The wait list was 5 years minimum. "I'll get tested for donation," I said, holding her hand in the hospital. "Tommy." "No." Tears streamed down her face. "I couldn't ask." "You're not asking." "I'm offering," I interrupted. Of course, I was a match. The surgery cost me $45,000 in medical debt, even with insurance. 6 weeks of recovery. Liquid diet. Sleeping propped up because lying flat felt like drowning. 1 kidney for the rest of my life. But when Megan visited, brought me Jell-O cups, kissed my forehead, I could have sworn it was worth it. "You saved my life," she whispered. "I'll never be able to repay you." She was right about that part. Recovery was hell, but Megan made it bearable. She'd sit by my bed, work on her design projects while I dozed, posted about her guardian angel on Instagram. It was the first time she posted me publicly. Her mom flew in from San Francisco and cried when she saw us together. "Not many boys would do what you did," she said. "You're special, Tommy." After we healed, Megan practically lived at my apartment, cooked dinner, studied beside me, fell asleep on my shoulder watching Netflix. The whole time we weren't officially dating, she needed time to process the trauma, but we were something. When she couldn't afford textbooks, I bought them. When her laptop died, I maxed out my credit card for a MacBook Pro. "For your design portfolio," I said. For our future, she'd kiss my cheek. Called me her hero. Again and again. I maxed out my last credit card, handed her the box. She kissed me like I was oxygen, tasted like strawberry lip gloss, and lies I was too desperate to. 2 weeks later, I was organizing our study group when my laptop died. She was in the bathroom. "Just use mine," she called out. Passwords on the sticky note. I opened her computer. Image was still up. A group chat notification popped up. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. "Number 20 just delivered." Megan had written. "iPhone secured." The messages loaded instantly. "Wait, this is the kidney guy?" Someone named Jess replied. "They're all the same. Lonely nerds who think kindness is love. Tommy still thinks we're soulmates because I held his hand during dialysis. LOL." I scrolled up. Found the spreadsheet. 20 names. 20 guys. 20 phones at +1 each. My hands shook. I screenshotted everything. Closed the laptop just as Megan came back. "Find what you needed?" she asked, settling beside me. "Close. So close I could smell her shampoo." "Yeah," I said. "Found everything." She smiled, touched my arm, the same gesture that had started it all. That moment, feeling her fingers on my arm while my kidney filtered her blood, a different kind of numbness spread through me. The kind that comes with understanding. 5 years of giving. And what had I learned? Only that some people harvest your love like organs. I'd been donating. Time to start collecting. I changed majors the next week. Threw myself into anatomy, physiology, kinesiology. Learned every muscle, every joint, every way the human body could fail. Megan thought I was inspired by our experience. Really, I was becoming her worst nightmare. We kept playing our roles. She kept taking. I kept giving. Graduation came. Megan got her design job. Moved into her new house. The one built on 20 broken hearts and 1 stolen kidney. She started pulling away, just like the spreadsheet predicted. Slowly ghosting the kidney donor who'd outlived his usefulness. But I wasn't done. I got my PT license. Specialized in rehabilitation and insurance assessment. Built my reputation. Waited. With her severe anemia and poor immune system, I knew it was only a matter of time. Her hip gave out 4 years later at 27. Surgery went fine, but she needed placement for rehab. Lucky for her, she had a husband who knew the system inside and out. I made the arrangements that same afternoon, pulling strings with colleagues who owed me favors from years of covering their shifts and helping with difficult cases. The intake coordinator at Swedish Medical Center's rehab wing nodded when I mentioned Megan's name, already familiar with her case from the surgeon's notes about post-operative complications. 3 days later, I was pushing her wheelchair through the automatic doors, my hands steady on the rubber grips, while she complained about the bumpy ride from the parking garage. The rehabilitation unit smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food, and I watched Megan's nose wrinkle as we passed the nurses' station, where staff members looked up from their computers to assess the new patient. Room 247 had a view of the parking lot, and a single bed with those plastic rails that made every patient look fragile, which Megan played up perfectly by wincing as 2 orderlies helped transfer her from the wheelchair. The orthopedic surgeon arrived within an hour, Dr. Patel with his thick glasses and careful way of explaining medical details, while I sat in the corner chair taking notes on my phone about infection risks and weight-bearing restrictions, and the importance of following exact protocols to prevent complications that insurance companies love to deny coverage for. Megan nodded along, but I could see her eyes glazing over, more interested in when she could get pain medication than understanding why putting too much weight on the surgical site could cause permanent damage. That evening after visiting hours ended, I drove home to my 1-bedroom apartment and spread 5 years' worth of receipts across the dining table, organizing them by date, while cross-referencing bank statements that showed every withdrawal, every maxed credit card, every loan I'd taken out while she was building her collection of victims. My phone lit up with her text about missing me already, calling me her hero like she'd done 1,000 times before, and I screenshot it to add to the folder labeled evidence that already contained 847 images. The next morning, I woke at 5 a.m. to prepare my kidney-friendly breakfast, measuring exactly 8 ounces of water to go with my low-protein oatmeal, while my laptop displayed Washington state fraud statutes that I'd been studying for months. Learning that financial exploitation required proving intent and that the statute of limitations gave me 2 more years to build my case. At work, I guided Megan through her first physical therapy session in the rehab gym, demonstrating proper hip flexion exercises, while Jake Morrison watched from across the room where he was working with an elderly stroke patient. During our break, he cornered me by the water cooler, asking how I ended up married to someone like Megan. And I gave him the practiced answer about college sweethearts and life taking unexpected turns, knowing the real story would sound like something from a crime documentary. Later that afternoon, Megan put on her best performance during therapy, tears streaming down her face as she claimed the pain was unbearable, even though I'd seen her moving fine when she thought no one was watching. And I documented everything in her chart with clinical precision, noting pain level 9 out of 10 and requests for increased opioid dosage that would create a paper trail for anyone who knew what patterns to look for. The next day, I used my access as both her spouse and healthcare provider to pull up her insurance history in the hospital billing office, discovering 3 previous claims in Oregon, California, and Nevada for accidents that resulted in significant payouts, each one following the same pattern of initial injury, complicated recovery, and maximum insurance settlements. That evening, Marcus called from San Francisco to check on the patient, and I kept my voice neutral as I updated him on her progress, careful not to mention the kidney he still didn't know about or the debt that had destroyed my credit or the spreadsheet of victims I'd found on her laptop years ago. On day 4, everything shifted when Dr. Rachel Torres from the Insurance Review Board showed up to observe my therapy session with Megan, her sharp eyes catching every exaggerated grimace and theatrical struggle with movements I'd seen Megan perform easily in private. And afterward, she pulled me aside with a knowing look. Over coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Rachel mentioned she'd been investigating unusual claim patterns across multiple states. Her words careful but pointed, as she explained how some patients had histories that raised red flags. And I kept my expression neutral even as my pulse hammered because this was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Rachel set down her coffee cup and pulled out her phone to check something while I sat there trying to look calm even though my heart was pounding because finally, someone was looking into this mess. 3 days passed in a blur of PT sessions and documentation before everything shifted on day 5 when I walked into Megan's room to find a woman in designer clothes arguing with the charge nurse about the quality of care. Linda Sullivan had arrived from California, and the second she saw me, her face went from angry to calculating in about half a second. She rushed over and grabbed my arm saying she needed to speak to administrators immediately about her daughter's treatment while Megan watched from the bed with this look that made my stomach drop because I'd seen that exact same expression when she was planning something back in college. I'm really curious how Tommy kept going to work every day knowing what Megan did. Like, how did he look at her during those therapy sessions without showing any anger? That takes such strong self-control to pretend everything's normal while planning your next move. I excused myself to update charts, but stayed close enough to watch them through the doorway as Linda leaned over the bed whispering instructions while Megan nodded along like they were rehearsing for a play. Later that day, I was reviewing notes in the hallway when Linda cornered the surgeon demanding stronger pain medication for Megan, her voice carrying down the corridor as she insisted her daughter was suffering unnecessarily. Through the partially open door, I could see her coaching Megan on how to describe the pain, showing her where to point and what words to use, and I documented every detail in my phone while pretending to check emails. The next morning, I went back to our apartment, grabbed some clean scrubs, and decided to check the closet for my old running shoes, when I spotted something that made me freeze. Megan's laptop from college, the one she claimed broke right after graduation, was sitting behind a box of winter clothes. My hands shook as I pulled it out and opened it. Watching the screen light up perfectly fine, and there was the password saved in the browser, just like she always did, because she was terrible at remembering them. The emails loaded immediately, and I felt like someone had punched me in the gut when I saw the subject lines. Message after message between her and Linda discussing the Seattle mark, with my name listed as Kidney Guy number 20 in their coded language, complete with timelines and projected payouts from insurance claims. I took screenshots of everything, uploaded them to 3 different cloud services, then put the laptop back exactly where I found it, while my mind raced with the implications of what I'd just discovered. Day 7 arrived with team rounds at Swedish Medical Center, where I presented Megan's progress notes in my most professional voice, while Rachel sat in the corner taking her own notes and watching everything unfold. Megan performed her role perfectly, wincing at the right moments and describing symptoms that matched exactly what Linda had coached her to say, completely unaware that 2 different people were documenting her act. That evening back at my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel's presence, so I looked her up online and found article after article about her 20-year career investigating medical fraud with several high-profile convictions that had made national news. Her being assigned to Megan's case wasn't random, and I realized she must have been tracking patterns across multiple claims before this one popped up on her radar. The next day at the rehab gym, Jake pulled me aside during a break and mentioned something odd, saying he'd seen Megan walk normally to the bathroom when she thought no one was watching, joking about her miraculous recovery between sessions. I added his observation to my growing collection of notes while keeping my expression neutral and thanking him for the heads up. Day 9 brought the meeting I'd been both dreading and hoping for, when Rachel requested to see me privately in a small conference room near the insurance offices. She opened a thick folder and spread out papers, showing Megan's claim history across 3 states, patterns highlighted in yellow marker, and said my wife's records were unusual to say the least. I weighed my options for about 10 seconds before reaching into my pocket and sliding a flash drive across the table, telling her she might find the contents relevant to her investigation. That evening, Megan started texting constantly, worried messages about how distant I seemed and asking if everything was okay between us. I typed back that I was just tired, and my kidney was acting up, knowing she'd accept that excuse without question, since she'd always been quick to use my health as a reason to avoid difficult conversations. The manipulation in her sudden concern was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd ever missed it before. Day 10 arrived with Linda in full performance mode at the hospital, threatening to sue for malpractice when the attending physician denied Megan's request for stronger opioids, her voice echoing down the hallway as she demanded to speak to administrators and claimed negligence. I stood in the doorway documenting every threat, every lie, every rehearsed gesture between mother and daughter while they played out their script, unaware that their audience had changed from sympathetic victim to careful observer collecting evidence. 3 days later in the PT break room, Jake poured coffee while the other therapists compared notes about difficult family members. And when someone mentioned the woman who kept demanding her daughter needed a special orthopedic bed that insurance would cover, Jake looked right at me and said Linda was intense, which made everyone start sharing their own stories about her calling the nurses station every hour and coaching her daughter through exaggerated pain responses during evaluations. I nodded along and took mental notes of every witness who'd seen the performance, every staff member who could testify about the rehearsed symptoms, while my phone buzzed in my pocket with a Seattle area code I didn't recognize. That night in my apartment, I called the number back, and Rachel's voice came through clear and urgent, explaining how the evidence I'd provided opened up something much bigger than insurance fraud. Because 20 victims across state lines meant mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that could put them away for decades. And when she asked if I was willing to cooperate fully, my hand shook as I said yes, remembering how Megan had taken not just my kidney, but pieces of 20 other lives. The next morning, I drove to the FBI field office downtown, where 2 agents in dark suits led me to a small room with a recording device. And for 3 hours, I laid out everything from the college spreadsheet to the current insurance scam, showing them 5 years of receipts and bank statements and text messages while they took notes about the mother-daughter operation that had destroyed so many people who just wanted to help. Walking out of that building, I knew there was no going back, but I still had to go home and pretend nothing had changed. Still had to wake up next to Megan the following morning and watch her sleep peacefully while my kidney worked inside her body, filtering her blood every second of every day, a permanent reminder of how completely she'd violated not just my trust, but my actual flesh. Later that morning at the hospital for discharge planning, Megan put on her best performance yet, insisting she needed a home health aide and a custom wheelchair, and grab bars installed in every room, while Linda stood behind the social worker mouthing instructions. And I documented every lie on my phone, noting how she could walk fine when she thought no one was watching, but suddenly needed assistance the moment any medical staff appeared. 2 days later, Marcus showed up at our house without warning, took one look at me and said, "I look terrible." Which wasn't surprising since I'd been sleeping maybe 3 hours a night trying to balance the investigation with keeping up appearances, so I blamed work stress and quickly closed my laptop before he could see the FBI case numbers and evidence folders filling my screen. The next day, Rachel met me at the hospital to show me similar cases she'd found in her research. Oregon recipients who'd exploited their donors and insurance fraud networks that operated across multiple states. But she said our situation was unique because the kidney donation added federal charges that could enhance every other crime they'd committed. That evening, I watched from the kitchen as Megan practiced her limp in the living room mirror, completely unaware that I'd installed security cameras the week before that captured every rehearsal, every normal stride between performances, creating time-stamped evidence of her deception. Needing to channel my anger somewhere productive, I started volunteering at the dialysis clinic where Megan used to get treatment, and meeting real patients who'd been waiting years for kidneys while eating restricted diets and spending hours hooked to machines, made my fury sharper and more focused, especially when I thought about how Megan had stolen a kidney from someone who actually deserved it. Finally, Rachel called to say the federal prosecutor wanted to meet. So I sat in another sterile office while he outlined how they'd identified 28 victims so far who'd lost over $400,000 combined. And with the evidence we'd gathered, both Megan and Linda faced 20 years in federal prison for their conspiracy. The next 3 weeks felt like walking through quicksand while pretending everything was normal. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6, shower, make breakfast, and drive to the clinic where I'd work with real patients who actually needed help. Then I'd come home to find Megan on the couch, usually with Linda, both of them bent over laptops and paperwork. Megan would look up and smile, complain about how much her hip hurt, how she could barely move, while I'd nod and bring her ice packs and pain meds she didn't need. The whole time, I was taking pictures of their paperwork when they went to the bathroom, recording conversations on my phone, documenting everything. Jake called me the next day, voice shaking. He'd gone to check on Megan during his rounds and caught her doing jumping jacks in her room, full range of motion, not a hint of pain. But the second she heard footsteps in the hall, she'd collapsed onto the bed, moaning and clutching her hip. When the nurses came in, she couldn't even stand without help. Jake wrote it all down in a statement for me, said he'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of physical therapy. That evening, Linda cornered me in the kitchen while Megan was in the shower. She put her hand on my arm, the same way Megan used to, and started talking about how we needed to support Megan's disability claim. The way they had Tommy's name written down as kidney guy number 20 makes me wonder how long they've been planning this whole thing. Did they pick him out in college, or was meeting him just lucky timing for them? After everything she'd been through, Linda said, squeezing my arm, "Didn't Megan deserve some compensation for her suffering?" The touch made my skin crawl because it was exactly like watching a snake teach its baby how to hunt. The next morning at the PT gym, I worked with Mrs. Olson, a 70-year-old woman who'd had the same hip surgery as Megan. She gripped the parallel bars with shaking hands, sweat dripping down her face as she fought for every single step. Behind her, Megan sat in a wheelchair she didn't need, watching and taking notes, then deliberately making her own movements look worse than Mrs. Olson's. When I helped Megan with her exercises later, she could barely lift her leg an inch, whimpering with fake pain, while Mrs. Olson kept pushing through real agony in the background. That night, the FBI showed up at my apartment while Megan was at another doctor appointment. 2 agents in suits who looked like they'd seen too much set up recording devices in my living room, bedroom, even the kitchen. 1 more week, they promised. Just 1 more week, and they'd have enough evidence of her attempting new fraud to make the charges stick. I agreed, feeling like my whole life had turned into some weird spy movie, except the villain was sleeping in my bed, and I'd given her my kidney. Rachel called me into her office the next day, and spread out files across her desk, like she was dealing cards. 12 states. Megan and Linda had hit 12 states over the past 8 years, always the same pattern. Always targeting healthcare workers who thought they were helping someone in need. Insurance fraud, disability fraud, workers' comp fraud, even a few romantic scams thrown in for variety. But I was special, Rachel said, tapping the file with my name on it. The kidney donation made me their biggest score yet, both financially and emotionally. They'd gotten cocky, Stayed too long in one place, tried for too big a payout. The next morning, Megan woke me up by pressing against my back, running her fingers through my hair while she talked about our future. All the things we could do with her settlement money, the house we could buy, the vacations we could take. I lay there calculating how many dialysis patients could get treatment with the money she was trying to steal. How many people like the old me were out there right now, falling for the same con. At the hospital for her follow-up, the surgeon examined Megan and made notes about her remarkable recovery. How well she was healing, how her range of motion was actually above average for this stage. Megan immediately started crying, demanded he change his notes, claimed she was in constant severe pain and could barely function. She actually grabbed his hand and tried to move it to write something different on the chart. He pulled away, made more notes, and I watched the camera I knew was recording from my jacket pocket. Catch the whole thing. That night I cooked spaghetti while Megan and Linda sat at the kitchen table discussing their next move. Linda had been researching my colleague, Jake. Noticed he'd been single for 2 years after a bad divorce. Seemed lonely. Always volunteering for extra shifts. Megan said he seemed sweet, probably had good insurance through the hospital. My hand tightened on the knife I was using to chop garlic, and I had to focus on breathing steady, keeping my face neutral, not letting them see how much I wanted to warn Jake to run. Later, I couldn't sleep, just lay there staring at the ceiling while Megan snored beside me. I grabbed my laptop and found forums for kidney donors, reading story after story of people who'd given organs to partners who left them afterward. Some lost their kidneys to wives who cheated, others to boyfriends who'd been using them all along. But my story was different, special, in the worst way. I started typing, telling everything anonymously, and within an hour had dozens of responses from people who understood, who'd been through their own versions of medical manipulation. They got it in a way nobody else could. What it felt like to have someone harvest your love like an organ, to realize you'd been nothing but spare parts to someone you'd have died for. The support from strangers online kept me going through the next few weeks as the FBI investigation heated up. Day 30 found me in their downtown office, sitting across from 2 agents who played recordings that made my stomach turn. Megan's voice filled the room, talking to Linda about booking flights to Mexico once the settlement money cleared. International flight risk, the lead agent noted, tapping his pen on the desk. This accelerates our arrest timeline. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral, even though hearing her plan to run with my money, with the life I'd given her, felt like losing that kidney all over again. The next day at the hospital, I found Jake during his break, and mentioned casually how some patients might try to take advantage of vulnerable situations. He caught on quick, started documenting every time Megan's story didn't add up, every time her supposed limitations vanished, when she thought no one was watching. Day 32 started with Megan kissing me goodbye, saying she had therapy. But the FBI's surveillance team later showed me security footage of her at the mall, carrying shopping bags that someone with her claimed disabilities shouldn't be able to lift. I kept playing my part at home, helping her with tasks she didn't need help with, listening to her complain about pain she wasn't feeling. Linda showed up on day 33 with a folder of medical records from some doctor I'd never heard of, all supporting Megan's disability claim. While they talked in the living room about their case, I snuck photos of the documents with my phone, noting how the dates didn't match up, how the signature looked traced. The FBI forensics team would later confirm they were complete forgeries. Day 34 hit different though. I had to stop by the dialysis clinic for some paperwork, and in the waiting room sat a young mother, maybe 25, her little girl drawing pictures while they waited. The mom needed a kidney, had been waiting 2 years already. The daughter showed me her drawing, stick figures of her and mommy at the park. I thought about my kidney filtering Megan's blood right now, keeping alive someone who used that gift to hurt more people, when it could have saved someone who deserved it. Had to leave before I said something I'd regret. The next day at the PT gym, I watched from my office as Megan filmed herself struggling with 5-pound weights for her lawyer's evidence package. Between takes, when she thought the camera was off, she was texting rapidly on her phone. The FBI's phone monitoring later showed she was messaging 3 other guys, setting up dates, working new marks even while building a case against me. They captured everything, every lie, every manipulation. Day 36 brought a meeting at the federal prosecutor's office. "We have enough for arrest," she confirmed, spreading out the evidence files, "but more documentation strengthens sentencing. Can you continue?" I agreed, even though going home to Megan got harder every day. That night, day 37, I came home to find Megan and Linda in the kitchen, practicing her court testimony. They were role-playing how she'd described my negligent care, how I'd caused her permanent disability through incompetence. The lies flowed so easy, like water, each one crafted to destroy my career and reputation. I recorded it all on my phone from the hallway. Day 38 started with me refilling my medications, extra careful about my kidney health since I only had one left. The pharmacy tech, a young woman who'd helped me for years, mentioned she'd seen Megan jogging past the pharmacy yesterday morning. She looked great, she said innocently, really moving fast. Another witness to add to the list. That evening, day 39, Marcus called while Megan was in the shower. He mentioned Mom had been asking about grandchildren again, wondering when Megan and I would give her some grandkids to spoil. I looked through the bathroom door at Megan planning her next con on her phone even in the shower, texting with the water running, and realized some futures were already stolen before they could exist. The investigation was almost over. The arrest coming soon, but these small moments of seeing what could have been hurt, almost as much as the betrayal itself. The next morning, Rachel called me into the hospital conference room, where she'd spread out files across the entire table, her face pale as she pointed to a map with red pins scattered across 8 more states, telling me they'd found victims in places I'd never even heard of. One guy in Montana, who'd lost his house trying to pay for his mom's fake treatments. Another in Maine, who'd sold his boat, his truck, everything he owned before hanging himself in his garage last winter, when the bills finally crushed him. My kidney had saved someone who drove a man to suicide. Rachel showed me his photo, some regular guy with a fishing hat and a smile that reminded me of my dad, and I had to sit down because the room started spinning. Linda arrived at our house the next afternoon with a briefcase full of scripts, literally scripts she'd written out for Megan to memorize for the depositions, and I watched from the hallway as they practiced in the living room. Linda playing the lawyer while Megan worked on producing tears on command, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while reciting lines about permanent disability and lost dreams. I recorded everything on my phone from behind the doorframe, watching my wife rehearse her victim performance like she was auditioning for a movie role. The FBI office downtown felt like something out of a TV show with agents clicking through computer screens, showing wire transfers bouncing from Seattle to the Cayman Islands to Switzerland, cryptocurrency wallets with balances that made my student loans look like pocket change and gold purchases through shell companies Linda had set up using dead people's social security numbers. 12 states with the same pattern makes me wonder how they picked which healthcare workers to target. Was there something specific about each person that made them perfect victims? The lead agent, a woman with tired eyes who'd been tracking Linda for 3 years, admitted I'd gotten closer than any of their undercover operations ever had. Back at work the next day, Jake cornered me in the break room, mentioned how Megan seemed to be walking better lately, how she'd been carrying heavy shopping bags when he saw her at the mall, and I had to act surprised and grateful, thanking him for noticing her improvement while my stomach churned. That evening, I started packing evidence into boxes for the prosecutor, found our old college photos tucked between medical records, and stared at one where Megan was laughing at some joke I'd made outside the chemistry building, her smile looking completely different now that I knew what lived behind it, calculating and cold, where I'd once seen only warmth. She burst through the door the next afternoon practically glowing, announced she'd hired the best personal injury attorney in Seattle, some shark who'd won millions in medical malpractice cases, planning to sue the hospital, the surgeon who'd done her hip replacement, even my employer for inadequate accommodations, and she kissed my cheek while explaining how we'd be rich once the settlements came through. The surgeon called me at work the next day, his voice shaking as he read the lawsuit claims alleging permanent disability from surgical negligence, showing me pages of accusations that could end his career. And I quietly assured him it would never make it to court while he kept asking what he'd done wrong. This good man who'd actually helped hundreds of people now facing ruin because of Megan's greed. The prosecutor's office felt smaller than I remembered as she laid out the timeline, explaining they'd arrest Megan and Linda in exactly 72 hours, but needed them to access the offshore accounts one more time to seal the case. And I suggested telling Megan the insurance settlement was ready for deposit, knowing she'd jump at the chance to move more money. Our last dinner together felt like a performance where we both knew our roles. Megan chattering about house hunting in Bellevue with our settlement money, while I smiled and poured wine and memorized every detail of her face for the witness stand, watching her plan a future built on money she'd never touch. The next morning, I waited until she left for her fake physical therapy appointment before pulling out the go bag I'd hidden in the garage, stuffing it with clothes, medications, documents, and the keys to Marcus's spare room, knowing that after tomorrow, I'd need somewhere safe to stay when everything exploded. The investigation moved faster than I expected. And 2 months later, I was sitting in a federal courthouse conference room with 23 grand jury members staring at me, while I explained how I'd given my kidney to someone who'd been running a romance scam the whole time. The prosecutor had me walk through every detail, from that first drop textbook, to the surgery bills, to finding her spreadsheet of victims. And when I finished talking, the room was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning humming. They indicted on all counts within an hour. 5 days later, I was back at the dialysis clinic, where I'd started volunteering, helping patients get comfortable in their chairs, when an older woman grabbed my arm and said she'd seen me on the news, that I'd saved others from falling for the same trick. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like maybe I'd done something right. The next week, I finally started seeing a therapist who specialized in fraud victims, and she explained how what happened to me was systematic abuse, that Megan had groomed me just like predators groom their victims, giving me the vocabulary to understand why I'd been so blind to what was happening. Moving into a new apartment 5 days after that was harder than I thought it would be. Standing in my old place with boxes of college photos and memories, but I threw them all in the trash, except for the evidence copies the prosecutor needed for trial. Then everything exploded when the story went national 10 days later, with 28 victims coming forward after seeing Megan and Linda's photos on every news site. My phone ringing non-stop with reporters wanting interviews, and other guys wanting to share their stories of how they'd been scammed too. The pretrial hearing came 90 days after the arrests, and seeing Megan in that orange jumpsuit made my stomach turn because she'd lost so much weight and looked 10 years older. But when she pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her eyes found mine across the courtroom, the pure hatred there reminded me exactly who she really was. A few days later, I found myself in a conference room with 7 other organ donors who'd been exploited by the recipients, and someone made a joke about us being the kidney club, which got everyone laughing. People laugh when they're trying not to cry. The prosecutor met with me again a week before trial to go over my testimony, telling me to just tell the truth, because the evidence would speak for itself. But I could see in her eyes that she knew how hard this was going to be. My morning routine had changed completely by then. Checking my kidney function with test strips, taking my medications, drinking exactly the right amount of water, constantly aware that one organ was doing the work of 2 and would be for the rest of my life. Finally, 150 days after the arrests, I walked into that packed courtroom where other victims filled the gallery, and Megan sat at the defense table shooting daggers at everyone, while Linda dabbed at her eyes with tissues. And when they called my name to take the stand, I stood up knowing this was just the beginning of a trial that would drag on for weeks. The second day, they called me back to the stand, and I sat there for 6 straight hours going through every single receipt, every text message, every bank transfer, while Megan's attorney kept trying to make me look like some bitter ex who made everything up. But the evidence spoke louder than his questions ever could, because I had screenshots of everything, dates and times and amounts that matched perfectly with my medical bills and credit card statements. And when he tried to suggest I gave her money willingly, I just pointed to the messages where she promised to pay me back, where she called me her hero while planning her next scam behind my back. 3 days later, the courtroom filled with other victims, and I watched as one by one they told their stories. A nurse who lost her house after lending Megan $30,000 for her fake mother's cancer treatment. A respiratory therapist whose marriage fell apart when his wife found out he'd emptied their savings for a girl who claimed she needed emergency surgery. And the pattern became so clear that even Megan's attorney looked uncomfortable as healthcare worker after healthcare worker described the same lies, the same manipulation, the same devastating financial losses. On day 8, Megan finally took the stand and tried to spin this whole story about how I forced her into everything. How I was controlling and abusive and she was just a victim trying to survive. Fake tears rolling down her face as she claimed I threatened her if she didn't take the money. But then the prosecutor pulled up her emails where she bragged to friends about her goldmine of lonely medical nerds and asked her to read them out loud. And suddenly, those tears dried up real fast. 2 days after that, Linda took her turn on the stand and threw her daughter completely under the bus, claiming it was all Megan's idea, that she was just a mother trying to help her sick child, that she never knew about the other victims, or the fake medical bills, or any of it. And that's when Megan lost it completely. Jumped up from her seat, screaming at her mother about how she taught her everything, how they planned it together, how Linda was the one who picked the targets, and the judge had to call a recess while security got her under control. The closing arguments came on day 12 with the prosecutor laying out what he called the vampire scheme. How they didn't just take money, but blood and trust and hope from people who dedicated their lives to helping others. How they targeted healthcare workers specifically, because they knew we'd understand the medical terms and believe the lies. And he asked the jury for maximum sentences, to send a message that this kind of calculated cruelty wouldn't be tolerated. Then we waited, and for 3 days the jury deliberated, while I tried to work like normal. Tried to see my PT patients, and do my exercises, and pretend my whole life wasn't hanging on what 12 strangers decided. And Jake would show up with coffee, and just sit with me during breaks, not saying much because what was there to say really? Day 183. They called us back, and when the judge read guilty on all counts, Megan just stared straight ahead, like she was somewhere else entirely, while Linda collapsed into her chair sobbing. And around me, I heard other victims crying with relief, some hugging each other, some just sitting there like they couldn't believe it was real. The next morning, I woke up, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel that weight crushing my chest. Just made breakfast and checked my kidney function like always. And breathed without feeling like I was drowning. Without wondering what new bill would show up, or what new lie I'd discover. 2 weeks later, I sat at my desk trying to write my victim impact statement, trying to figure out how you put a price on an organ, on years of debt that destroyed your credit, on the trust that got ripped out of you so completely, you still flinch when someone asks to borrow $5. And I kept starting over because how do you make a judge understand that it wasn't just money she took, but a piece of who you were? How did the prosecutor know to wait exactly 72 hours before arresting them? That timing seems so specific, like they must have been tracking something really important about those offshore accounts to pick that exact window. The sentencing came on day 210, and the judge didn't hold back. Called it one of the most exceptionally cruel schemes he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Said the deliberate targeting of healthcare workers who devoted their lives to helping others showed a level of moral bankruptcy that shocked the conscience. And when he gave Megan 22 years and Linda 18, when he ordered $400,000 in restitution to be divided among all the victims, I felt something inside me finally start to uncurl. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the beginning of something like peace. 2 weeks after sentencing, I sat in the prosecutor's office signing restitution paperwork, my hand cramping after the 20th form, while other victims filed in and out doing the same thing. And we started exchanging phone numbers, email addresses, creating a group chat that would ping at all hours with updates, support, dark jokes, only we could understand. The prosecutor warned us collection would take years, maybe decades, but having that paper in my hand, seeing Megan's name on the defendant line, felt like progress. 4 days later, back at the hospital for my regular shift, the director called me into her office, offered me the lead therapist position, said my integrity through everything that happened, showed the kind of leadership they needed, and I accepted. Immediately started developing training modules on recognizing manipulation tactics in healthcare settings, making sure my staff could spot the red flags I'd missed. Within a week, I was meeting with 3 other organ donor victims from our group chat at a coffee shop downtown, sketching out plans on napkins for what would become Guardian Angels, a support organization specifically for exploited donors. And by the end of the month, we'd filed the nonprofit paperwork, set up a website, started fielding calls from people across the country with similar stories. Dating felt impossible. Trust felt like a foreign language I'd forgotten how to speak. So I threw myself into work, volunteering at the dialysis center on weekends, rebuilding my credit one payment at a time, small steps that felt huge after everything. 8 months after the arrest, the first restitution check arrived. $1,200 that barely dented my medical debt, but I photocopied it anyway, framed the stub, hung it next to my PT license as a reminder that justice might be slow, but it was moving. At the dialysis clinic, I met Sarah, 19 years old, matching blood type with her older sister who needed a kidney, and I spent 3 hours walking her through every protection she should have in place, red flags to watch for, legal documents to sign, making sure she wouldn't end up like me. A documentary filmmaker reached out through Guardian Angels, wanted to tell our story, and I agreed on the condition that all profits went to our victim fund. Spent 2 days on camera reliving everything, knowing people needed to hear how predators could hide behind love. Marcus brought his girlfriend Amy to dinner at our parents' house, and she knew my whole story, but treated me like just Tommy. Not the kidney guy, not the victim, just Marcus's younger brother who made bad jokes and overcooked the pasta. The first time in almost a year, I felt normal. Every morning, I checked my kidney function, took my medications, saw Megan's mugshot on our support group materials when I updated the website.